we're very, very pleased that you're all here tonight, is that those of you who are back where Judge Fauntleroy is seem to be so far off, is that I think there may be a few seats around up here. And while I'm talking, if you wouldn't mind coming a bit nearer, those of you who seem to be so far off, if that's all right. There are two seats over here at number 8.
Boorstin, director of the National Museum of History and Technology, came to the Smithsonian Institution from the University of Chicago, where he was a distinguished service professor of American history. He had served on the faculty of that university since 1944, with assignments abroad from time to time as visiting professor and lecturer at some of the world's most outstanding universities. Dr. Boorstin was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He received his undergraduate education at Harvard College, 2 law degrees from Oxford University in England, and a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Yale. The 3rd volume of Dr. Boorstin's most extensive work has just been completed, The Americans, which he has been writing for 20 years and has been described as a sweeping new view of American history, revealing in the story of our past some of the secrets of the distinctive character of American culture. Dr. Boorstin has spent much of the last 30 years trying to rediscover the meaning of American civilization. By living abroad, he has looked at the United States from the outside and seen how others look at us. From a background in other disciplines, he has found ways of thinking about our history that may have escaped more conventional historians. We are honored to have Dr. Boorstin speak to us this evening. Dr. Boorstin.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here tonight to take part in the program of this interesting and remarkable experiment. I might just, before I begin, make a historical or even perhaps a statistical remark that might have escaped the notice of some of you here. The Smithsonian Institution, as we all know, is an ancient institution that's been going for a century and a quarter. But while can you hear me now? Good. The Smithsonian Institution is an ancient institution that's been going for over a century and a quarter, but its directors, fortunately, are not quite as ancient as the institution. The Anacostia Museum is not the most ancient of the enterprises within the Smithsonian, but I think it may interest some of you to know that your director, my friend John Kennard, is the senior director of any Smithsonian museum. John? He may not look it, but he really is. But nowadays in Washington, of course, it's very hard to get one's bearings. Everything seems to be shifting around. We have young-looking people like John being our senior directors, and even pronouns seem to take on a new meaning. Some years ago, when, beyond the memory, I'm sure, of most of the people here, when people talked about it, everybody knew what you were talking about. There was an it girl who was Clara Bow, and people talked about it with some pleasant embarrassment. But nowadays, when you talk about it, you're talking about something else. Of course, we're talking about Watergate. And everything seems to take on a kind of innuendo. There's a private language or an unspoken language. I remember when I was a student in England, the old ladies used to complain that, you know, young people nowadays will talk about anything. And the reply from the other stuffy lady was, you know, and they won't talk about anything else. The same thing might be said of Washington today, but the antecedents are somewhat different. Tonight, I would like to speak as a historian and try to bring together some of the problems of the historian and the museum director. I would like to talk about some of the problems that afflict the historian who goes in search of the past, if the past that he goes in search of is not that which other historians have written about, but rather is the way it really was, the experience of living people. And my own preoccupation and my own writing has been to try to find ways to recapture the experience of people, to try to define history not as what historians talk about, but rather as what people have lived, and to try to find what it was like to be alive. And if the historian goes in search of that experience, he immediately comes against certain problems which are not obvious at first, and that leads me to suggest, if I were to give a title to my talk tonight, I might call it, I hope unpretentiously, What Historians Don't Talk About. That's what I would like to try to talk about tonight, briefly. We forget that much of what remains to us from the past is the result not of reason or of design, but of accident. And sometimes the irony of those accidents is discouraging. For example, the archaeologist and anthropologist Graham Clark points out that if you were living in a prehistoric village and wanted to be sure that the architecture of your village was preserved to the future, you would allow it to be burned down, because we find that when you transmute the organic material of wood into, when you carbonate it and leave it in the burned form, it lasts much longer than when you leave it in the organic form. And there are many accidents of survival which determine the way we see the past. I first encountered this in my own research when I wanted to discover what it was that the 17th century New England Puritans were thinking about, what was important to them. And I discovered that the most widely circulating kinds of printed matter or reading matter were little sheets called the horn books, and a horn book was just an alphabetic sheet with some verses on it, which was called a horn book because it was covered with a piece of cow's horn, which was used to be transparent in the days before there was any celluloid. And these horn books were very common. Every schoolchild had one. And other very common book was the New England Primer, which was the first reading book for the students in school. But if you wanted to find a horn book or a primer from the 17th century, you would find it practically impossible. These books were used, and they were used up. But if you went into the rare book rooms of libraries, you could find multi-volume sets of theology, sometimes with uncut pages in mint condition, and of course these were the sources that historians would use to see what people were really reading. And I began to puzzle when I discovered this to be the case and found my colleagues spending so much time reading the heavy tomes and gingerly cutting the pages. And then when I came to the 19th century, I had a similar experience. I discovered that among the most widely circulating pieces of printed matter were the so-called Crockett almanacs. These were poorly printed sheets which had illustrations that could mean many things and were rather blurry, but which were printed in various places and circulated by the tens of thousands. These copies of the Crockett Almanac were carried about in vest pockets and hip pockets and saddle bags and passed around saloons and around the campfire, and they were almost all destroyed. You would have to pay several $100s for a single copy of a Crockett Almanac in not very good condition. But if you wanted to find out, for example, if you wanted to read any one of the 5-volume sets of the life of George Washington, or if you wanted to read John Marshall's Life of George Washington in 5 or 6 volumes, you could go and find a set in perfect condition in almost any second-hand furniture store. When the historian wants to know what people in the early 19th century were reading, why, naturally, he gets a set of that 6-volume Life of George Washington. Well, this set me to thinking about whether we historians were really learning about what people in the past had been experiencing, or whether we were just using the most convenient sources. And it led me to develop a theory which I would call, not entirely facetiously, the law of the survival of the unread, which is the notion that there is inevitably a tendency for those works to survive which are not used, so that by an ironic law, the historian who uses the surviving materials is almost always drawing on the materials that were not prominent in the lives of people in the past. As I began to think about this, I explored this question of what tends to survive and what doesn't survive from the past, and I made certain observations, and I will give you some of those observations with some examples, with the notion that we perhaps can explore them in discussion afterwards. But the tendencies to perpetuate and to rely on those objects which have not been important in the lives of people are almost unavoidable. And if we start with the most obvious, the tautologous example, it is that, of course, those things tend to survive from the past which are most durable and which are not removed or displaced. And a very good example of this, of how we are misled by this, is that, as most of us know, the spoken word is that which is most vivid and most important to all of us. The words of our mothers and fathers and of our children, which are spoken words, and yet those are the most ephemeral. They're gone with the wind. Whereas the written words, even though they may be less prominent in our consciousness, tend to survive. It's also true that certain kinds of monuments survive. And one kind of monument which survives from many cultures is the religious monument, and especially the monument which commemorates the dead. And I have a hunch that in our interpreting the past, we tend to give a more prominent place to religion than we ought to, simply because the monuments that have to do with religion, the tombstones and the churches and other objects, tend to last, while those containers in which people lived, their houses which they lived in every day and which were part of their daily experience, inevitably tended to disappear. Now, this is a particular problem in relation to American civilization. When we travel over Western Europe, we find that we are introduced not only to the cathedrals, but to the castles and palaces which have lasted from past centuries, and we are inclined to identify those with what we call civilization. When we come back to our own country, we find relatively few relics of the way people have lived in the past. And in fact, the most important American contributions to architecture, one of which is The balloon frame house, which was an ephemeral, easy to build and easy to dismount form, does not survive from an early period at all. The fact that those things survive which are durable, and that the things which are durable tend to be those which were built by the aristocracy and by priests and men of religion in the past, makes it much harder for us to recapture the experience in the past. Another part of the problem is what we might call the tendency toward the survival of the collected and the protected. We read those papers and documents which go into the Public Record Office. But the only documents that go into the Public Record Office are the documents that have to do with formal, organized legal groups. And yet, as this meeting attests, and as the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum attests, the community, the informal group, which tends not to have many archives and certainly tends not to have a vault in which to preserve it, is the institution which is hardest to recapture, even though that ephemeral institution may be most vivid and important in the lives of the people. Now, there are other examples of what I would call the tendency for the survival of the objects which are not used or which have a high intrinsic value. Our numismatic friends, and I hope some of you, or perhaps all of you, will visit our Hall of Money and Medals in the National Museum of History and Technology across the mall. The most attractive and most valuable objects there are a collection of gold coins. And our numismatic friends, our coin-collecting friends, speak about coin hoards. The hoard is one of the forms in which coins are preserved from the past. Well, what kinds of coins were put in the hoards? When people wanted to protect their money treasure from invaders and robbers, they didn't put together a pile of pennies and nickels and dimes, but they put together their gold pieces and all the other coins that were not very much circulated. So that when we find these hoards from the past, inevitably we tend to find those kinds of coins which were not much circulated, but which were most valuable, and we don't find the pennies and nickels and dimes of the past. They were not worth protecting. The same thing is true of many other kinds of civilization. There's a kind of you might say, a law of democracy that a democratic society tends to give a poor account of itself. A very good example is in the history of timekeeping. When you travel over Western Europe, you find in museums and palaces beautiful clocks, and extremely valuable clocks and watches. We have a few examples of those, not only in our National Museum of History and Technology, but in the building that Mrs. Post has given us, and elsewhere. The examples of clock building and timekeeping are treasures. Now, if you want, and these are preserved from the 15th and the 16th century. They're beautiful objects, jewels in themselves. The triumph of American technology, or horological technology, clock and watch building technology in the 19th century was the dollar watch. And when travelers from Europe came to this country, they were astonished to find that you could buy a timepiece for $1. Well, what happened when people bought dollar watch was, of course, that for a lot of the same reasons that made it possible to build a dollar watch, it wasn't worth repairing a dollar watch. The high cost of labor, relative high cost of labor in this country meant that it wasn't worth repairing them. So there are not very many dollar watches being preserved from the middle of the 19th century. And yet the dollar watch was probably the most prominent, or one of the most prominent, examples of timekeeping. Same thing was true in the development of firearms in this country. The kinds of firearms that tend to be preserved are the filigreed muskets, and later rifles, of which we have a good collection in the National Museum of History and Technology. but the triumph of American weapon making was the Colt revolver, the Kentucky rifle, and other weapons which were relatively easy to make and tended to be made on a mass production basis. The objects that were readily available were not worth repairing and tended not to survive. Now, there are many of the problems of interpreting the meaning of these objects when they do survive. Leo Szilard, the great physicist who had a part in making the first nuclear chain reaction at the University of Chicago, wrote an interesting book called The Voice of the Dolphins, in which he speculates on what happens when, after a Holocaust in the 21st century, someone comes to what used to be Times Square in New York and begins to dig. And he finds all sorts of objects, and among them he finds little compartments in which you could enter only by inserting a coin into the clock mechanism, and then you could turn the coin and open the door. And this wise archaeologist develops the theory that this is the way in which people went in to worship their god. They inserted a coin so they could serve the god of that time. The survival of objects is something which poses a problem to the historian, and also the very effort to study these objects creates special problems, and there's a tendency for professors to give undue attention to what is academically classifiable and examinaboutable. If you can't ask questions about it on an examination, it's not likely to be treated as an awfully important subject. So that literature, those forms of writing which are embodied in what are called the classics, tend to be given great prominence, while subliterature, which the Davy Crockett almanacs and much of folklore and popular ballads and popular literature, the bestsellers of the time, which do touch people, that kind of literature tends not to be studied and it tends not even to have the dignity of an academic subject. There are other ironies here, and I will mention only one or two more before I pause to have your contribution and hear some of your comments and questions about this interesting problem. One of the most misleading of the ironies of history is the tendency toward the survival of materials surrounding controversies. We are told by historians that we read the history of religion. When we turn to these books, what we really find is the history of religious controversy. The arguments that various theologians have had with each other about rather often very abstruse subjects, and this is what the kind of literature that accumulates, but we all know from our personal experience that the importance of religion is an intimate thing in our daily lives, and it's not the kind of thing that leaves a record. This has its counterpart in many other areas of history where it's very hard to learn the way people really lived, but it's easy enough to know what they argued about. Wars, of course, leave their chronicles, while peace does not tend to be so much chronicled. If we want to learn the history of what people have eaten in the past, for example, it's very difficult. I've tried to find out what people used to eat and drink in the 18th and early 19th centuries. It's very hard. But if you want to know what they argued about, if you want to write a history of vegetarianism or of prohibition, it's quite easy. Similarly, if you want to write a history of the family, it's really quite difficult because who was it? Was it Tolstoy who said that all happy families are alike and they don't leave a chronicle? We don't have a good history of the American family, but if you want to read a history of divorce, well, I could give you a number of references, in fact, quite a library telling you why people couldn't get on together. and the legal machinery for doing this. Similarly, it's very hard to follow the story of law enforcement. The people who were law-abiding don't leave much of a record. But the history of crime is something that has been chronicled, if anything excessively chronicled, and gets in the way of our perspective. Before I conclude, I would like to refer to a couple of the problems that arise from the way in which we find ourselves necessarily studying the past, especially if we look at the written record. Among the rules which professors of history tell their graduate students, one of them is you should always value most the primary source, what the person said about himself. And historians, therefore, pay a great deal of attention to the letters that people wrote, and especially to diaries. And the diarists are of the past, the people who kept journals and diaries. I don't know how many people here do that, but those people have been a rather interesting group in the past. I think sometimes someone ought to write a psychopathology of diarists, because a very large proportion of the great diarists in the past have either written in such a small handwriting that it was practically impossible to decipher, or they've tended to write in shorthand or in a cipher, a code. And it is interesting to speculate on the kind of traits of character that would lead someone like Samuel Pepys or William Byrd, both of whom were eloquent diarists, to go to a great deal of trouble to keep a record of everything they did and thought and wished and lusted after, and yet to go to the trouble to put it in a code so that it would be difficult for anyone to discover it, but tantalizing and perhaps enticing to people to want to get at these secrets. But the tendency to rely on the personal record is something that those of us ought to question from our common experience, as I think any of us would wonder about the common sense and good judgment of any friend of ours who every night rushed home and spent 2 hours writing in a small hand or in code an account of what had happened or what he thought had happened to him during that day. But historians find themselves understandably relying on this kind of thing. Now, finally, there is another, and perhaps the supreme irony in the problem of the historian who tries to use what remains from the past to discover the way people have lived in the past, and that is what I would call the survival of the victorious point of view. One of the things that I think is most interesting is the impression that we get of how an invention is made. An inventor is a person, as we are told, who gets an idea and tries it out and then, after a few years, succeeds. But that isn't the way inventions are made. Inventions are made by a community of people, about 99.44% of whom fail and are never heard of. And then there's that lucky man who draws on the ideas of others and the ideas that are prevalent in his time, and he succeeds, and the history of the invention is the history of that man. The same thing has been true about many aspects of our national history. American history has been written as if it were the history of a centralized nation, when of course this nation is a group of communities, and always has been. The people who came here in the 17th and 18th century, who came here voluntarily, and not all came voluntarily, didn't come because they wanted to build a great nation. Many of them came because they were fed up with what they had where they lived, wanted to find opportunity. They wanted to secede. And the secessionist tradition, which is the tradition of the reformer and the critic of society, is at least as important, perhaps more important in the building of our civilization as any other tradition. the people who moved away from the great centers of civilization, who wanted to go out in search of opportunity. These people were seceding from what they thought was an unacceptable society, and there were even examples, at least in the Second War, of individuals who thought that the most morally respectable way to avoid the draft was to secede from the nation as an individual and declare themselves a sovereign country, which is very much in the American tradition. But one of the consequences of this problem of what survives from the past and what doesn't is that the community, the informal group, the kind of group that we all represent here tonight, tends to be underestimated. The wishes of people coming together for their own purposes, trying to build something that is important to them, but which is not recorded in the chronicles of legislators or of constitution makers, these aspirations tend to fall out of view. I would like, before I conclude, or at least open the evening to your questions and comments, to remind you of a remark that Pirandello made, which I always found very suggestive, when he said, "A fact is like a prison, it shuts you in." And one of the temptations of the historian is always to assume that because he has an object, that therefore he has something the meaning of which is utterly clear. And I would like to suggest that perhaps the mission of the historian, as I see it, could be summarized in a paraphrase of Pascal, who also was concerned with this problem, when he said, and I will paraphrase here, "The historian knows that he dies and the advantage the universe has over him, even while others have forgotten. The historian does or can remain vividly conscious of the limits of his knowledge. Perhaps this is the unique sense among students of society today in which the historian can comprehend the world." Well, thank you. I would be glad to have your reactions or comments on this or any other direction about the problem of the historian and his relation to museums or anything else. I will receive the question directly. Thank you. Yeah, but then I can receive the question directly.
Okay, fine. Is that what I'd like to say just before Dan begins to entertain your questions, is that Mrs. Boorstin is here. Mrs. Boorstin, would you please stand? There she is. One other person that I failed to present to you, and of course after this evening I would indeed feel very badly about it because my mind would have failed me, the chairperson of the Smithsonian Advisory Committee to the museum, without whom I'm sure we wouldn't be here this evening, Carol Marsh. And a very delightful husband. Michael, would you stand? I'm sure that I would say we're very grateful to Dan for his very intellectually stimulating discussion that he's had with us. And perhaps some of you, if you go back in your minds to try to wonder what people were eating in the 18th and 19th centuries, some of you would probably reflect on some of the things that some of the people eat even today. And Mr. Dale's looking at me, he's probably thinking about chitlins and pig feet and some other things. But at any rate, it's like wrestling almost with a man, the intellectually stimulating discussion that Dan has presented to us. And I would leave Dan to answer any questions that you may have or statements that you would desire to make. And again, I would like to thank Dr. Boorstin for his very deeply intellectual and stimulating discussion that he's presented to us. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, John. May I ask, I don't know why if I may return the favor, it seems to me it would be most unfair not to introduce Mrs. Kennard, whom I had the pleasure of meeting tonight. And why hasn't she been introduced? This was all planned, you know. John said, I was going to introduce her, but I wanted to save her for the end. You do it. Well, I was trying this evening to raise some general questions about, oh, is that bad? Do you want this in the wrong place? Do you want me to leave it here? But may I turn the light out, or do you want this light on? All right. But I would be glad to go on from there to any other questions that occur to you as to what historians ought to be doing or ought not to be doing, or what museums ought to be inquiring into. You know, the more one pursues this profession of historian, the more one becomes convinced that it really is an impossible profession, in the sense that you're reaching for something that you can never recapture from the nature of the case. If men and women were immortal, you would just ask them how it was, and then it wouldn't be reliable either. But it might be more reliable than it is now. We can't ask people that, so that the historian, in a sense, is a witness to our mortality. He's there because we can't really know. And Mrs. Hutchinson and I were talking about this problem at dinner, and I'm impressed with how hard it is to know the way it really was, and especially to know what it meant to be alive for most of the people who were alive. Because most people didn't write books and didn't keep journals, and yet they were the world. And how can we recapture the experience of the people who didn't write down their experience? That's a very difficult question, and that's what makes it exciting to try to reach for that. And you can always sort of reach for it indirectly through the objects that most people use. Now, one of the advantages that the future historian will have in our time is that in a mass-producing nation, when you know that millions of automobiles of a certain make were circulated in a certain year, if you have one of those automobiles, you can have some notion that that object was present in the hands of millions of people. And before that time, it's when objects were unique objects, it's harder. Yes, please, Polly.
Ben, do you feel that, as I do, that the uniqueness of the Anacostia Museum will provide present-day historians, future historians, backgrounds, something that they've never had before? Do you feel that, I don't know if there's ever been anything like the Anacostia Museum before I've been there. Does this, how as a historian do you view its role in future history?
Well, I think the great thing about all institutions is their unpredictability. And I think that one cannot predict what will come out of an enterprise like this. I think it is interesting and valuable that the Anacostia Museum is developing an interest in the community and what the community has been, and through the Oral History Project and other projects in discovering what the community has been. I think that one of the interesting questions, and I was talking to Alton about it just at lunch the other day, I think one of the more interesting questions about Anacostia is to have what you can do with a museum that doesn't have a collection. Now, museums historically tend to grow out of collections of objects, and I think this is one of their opportunities, one of their problems too, because when you have a lot of objects, you can think that your mission is fulfilled when you display, or perhaps even when you don't display and just protect and conserve the objects. So that I think one of the interesting things to me about the Anacostia Museum is an enterprise which is really trying to develop the museum and explore the museum idea without a collection. And I gather, as Alton, from Alton, from John and others, that the Anacostia Museum has not set itself as its main object to collect a lot of valuable objects. I think to discover other ways, shall we say non-objective ways of accomplishing a museum's purpose of the increase and diffusion of knowledge is itself a challenge. And I think the other thing about it is that, which impresses me tonight, most museums, or many museums anyway, begin with collections and with curators. You begin with a community of people who want to have a museum. Well, I think, that's a rather interesting approach, and I think that is very promising. And I think the community, of course, the Smithsonian Institution is a place of experiment. I would have to say now, since and Alton and I were talking about this the other day, I would like to think of the Anacostia Museum as an avenue, as a pathway into the Smithsonian Institution as a whole, a place where new ways are discovered of relating a particular neighborhood, a particular community to the vast, unfathomable resources of the Smithsonian. And I think that it seems to me to be most important to pursue, and it's presumptuous of me to say this, but I think that there may be something in it, that to find ways such as those which you're now seeking to develop pride and interest and understanding of the meaning of that particular place where the community lives, the Anacostia neighborhood, and yet at the same time reach out through the Smithsonian to these vast collections that have been made by all of us over the century and a quarter that we've existed. The problem, the meaning of community in history, which is something that has very much concerned me as a historian, and which is not an easy subject, is one that I think the existence of the Anacostia Neighborhood Museum itself symbolizes. One of the problems, I think, of modern American life is the decline of neighborhood. A neighborhood comes from the word, is related to the word nigh, which means near. And there used to be a time when people felt close to the people they were near. Now, in many parts of the country, people don't even know the names of the people next door. They don't want to get involved. They'd rather not know their names. And I think that one of the main problems of our society, which is something that I've explored in this book of mine, which is just published, what I call the everywhere community, is that modern technology finds ways of relating people to each other at a distance. And now we're urbanites, or we're suburbanites, or we're consumers of the same product or whatever. But the relationship, the human relationship of you're feeling connected with somebody whom you see and live near is something which is scarce, and part of the problem comes from the vagueness of the city. There are many other problems. The notion of ghetto, that is the fact that such a large proportion of the people who live nigh to one another now, say in the case of the Negro community, people live where they do partly because they have been confined by the denial of civil rights and other devices, so that while the notion of neighborhood once was a delightful thing which expressed the way all mankind and womankind ought to be related to each other, through the accidents of American history and the weaknesses of men here, we have tended to identify unfortunately, neighborhood with ghetto, with with the restricted area in which people live, not because they want to be there, but because they don't have a choice. And I think that one of the great things about the Anacostia neighborhood community museum idea is the opportunity to emphasize the voluntary, creative opportunity that people find in their closeness to one another. But I think this lack of closeness, I think television is one of the worst, one of the worst influences in this regard, because television makes it possible for us to see so many things and share things with other people without being near the other people. You can see the same football game that somebody else sees and never be with the people. The laughter you hear is canned laughter, and so on. So that the opportunity to be near, to feel, sense the presence of another person is a precious thing, which the national Capitol symbolizes that. The shape of this room symbolizes that. So that I think that in so many ways the concept of a neighborhood and of an enterprise of a neighborhood has something almost, well, at the risk of being corny, I would say almost sacred about it. It's an opportunity for the fulfillment of an aspect of man which is by no means universal today.
Dan,
Please.
question.
Alton.
You mentioned the difficulty of historians grasping so much of the value of the past, and it flashes in my mind that in particular in some minority black communities and the Indian communities, that there was a kind of folk tale and music that seemed to be valuable kind of vehicle that was very often missed. Is that being utilized by historians of music? I know that you're interested in music as a kind of a measure of something of what happened in the past. I don't know if that's possible. It seems to me, particularly in the South, music was, as you know, the slave songs and the Indian songs were very important lives.
Yes.
Grandparents passed on stories to the next generation.
Yes.
These stories were picked up, they're often unrecorded.
Yes, well, I think music is a great democratic art, and I think that the place of music, the peculiar achievement of American music, of American popular music, which is substantially Afro-American music, seems to me, has not been widely enough recognized. And I have a chapter on this in my book, which I've just written, because I think it's a very interesting, and again, there's an irony here. It seems to me, well, some of the best books that I have read about the Afro-American experience and the Negro experience in America are the books about music. Leroy Jones's book is an excellent book, for example, and there are others. I think it's interesting to speculate on, and when the historian speaks of ironies and the way in which injustice produces benefits that nobody intended, it seems to me that the music that has come out of the Afro-American community, which then became American popular music and which reaches out all over the world today as American music, really, is a kind of byproduct, in a sense, of segregation. That is, it's a benefit that nobody intended and nobody wanted, and I don't know whether it's worth the price, but that's not the point. The point is that American jazz did seem to grow out of the peculiar awareness and sensitivity and creativity of the Negro community when it was by itself. And then one of the more interesting and more sadder things about the whole story is when the white jazz artists began to imitate the Negro jazz artists, and you began to have the classic jazz performances of Paul Whiteman and others. This was the whole story in reverse, and it's a very curious tale. But I think the story of American popular music really is a story of how the nation as a whole and the world eventually profited from the peculiar artistic sensitivity of these people. As for folklore, well, that's a very complicated question. There have been some good studies of urban folklore. One of the problems, I think, here is that the specialists in folklore, many of them, tend to be purists. That is, they tend to be pedantic and to say that nothing is folklore if it's written down. As I think some of our folklore purists insist that. I don't go with that. I think what is folklore in a society depends on the society somewhat. And one of the peculiarities of American life is that while in other civilizations the folklore tended to develop before the society became literate, that is, the Homeric legends and such folklores and the comparable legends in the Arthurian legends and others in England and France, grew up before the society as a whole could read and performed a very special role. Now, in this country, that didn't happen. In this country, folklore tended to develop after the society was literate, which meant that the cities had a special creative influence in folklore in this country, which it didn't have in earlier cultures. But I think one of the things that strikes me is the oddity of American civilization. Nobody could have imagined that this conglomeration of people from all over the world who had warred with each other elsewhere and cut each other's throats all over elsewhere could come here and manage to live together even as decently as we have. That's rather astonishing to a pessimist, and one has to be, I think, a pessimist to be a historian. And so anyway, I don't know whether that answers your question. I'm afraid I've rambled, but I'd be interested to know what you or somebody else thinks here. I'm sure the people here know much more about music than I do. I'm certain of that, and folklore too, I'm sure. Did you have a comment?
No further questions. I guess we
Thank you. Thanks all.
I want to thank our guests, and all of you have taken time out to come and join in this little festivity with us this evening, and we hope that in the very near future we'll have an opportunity to repeat this occasion. Thank you very much, and good night.